Good evening. Tonight I'll be talking with Robin Morgan. Robin compiled and edited Sisterhood is Powerful, the first anthology of writings from the feminist movement. Robin is also the author of two well-known books of poetry, Monster, and most recently, Lady of the Beasts. Her most recent book is Going Too Far, a personal chronicle of a feminist. Robin, welcome to Woman.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Is sisterhood still powerful?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's more complicated now. Or perhaps it always was, but we couldn't afford in the early days to pay that much attention to the complexities because the initial grappling with the enormity of the problem was so pressing. But I think that sisterhood, if anything, is deeper, trickier, more costly, but also more global in a way.
How more costly?
Well, I think it's less dramatic. I think it means a long haul, or is beginning to. I think that we're growing up, a lot of us, as individual women and as a movement. And what that means is a realization that it's not going to happen overnight, which our rhetoric may have, recognized earlier on, but I think, at least in my gut, I never recognized it.
Well,
I thought
maybe
it was...
the rhetoric early on might have been a little misleading, too.
I think so.
I think we may have implied that it was going to happen a lot faster.
Well, I think we also believed that, and I think it was a passionately well-meant error, if there is such a thing, in that the crushing intensity of those first realizations and the seeming vacuum to which those cries were being addressed when the patriarchy at large was still sort of going around and saying, what is it you people want, or just finding the whole issue, hilarious. And the competition with which women found ourselves in with other oppressed peoples, as if there were only one crumb and it had to be divided up. I mean, attacks from every conceivable front with almost no one taking us seriously, meant that the pain was so intolerable. If one couldn't envisage feminist revolution within 24 hours, you didn't see how you could survive the 25th hour. And I think what we're beginning to realize is that not only have we survived it, but there's going to be a long time before the kind of profound changes that feminism implies will begin to really happen. Which is not to say that we haven't covered a lot of ground already. I think that things have improved. It's just that if we settle for that, in another 100 years, there will have to be a whole bunch of women starting afresh, unearthing their history, which by that time will be us. We pass a flaming matchstick on, then to other feminists.
Before we get too heavily into the current situation and the book, which is wonderful and open and honest, and I really enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
I think most people know you from Sisterhood is Powerful, which was really a very beginning book in lots and lots of ways. And I'm curious to know what raised your consciousness. Why did Sisterhood is Powerful happen? What made it happen?
Well, I was a young housewife, writer, in the late 50s and early 60s. I'm married in the early 60s, but I was a writer already in the late 50s, and I then became involved in the New Left. So I was, within a fairly short period of time, given the intensity of the 60s, radicalized and a militant leftist through the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, etc. And when feminism first came into my life, I had defenses a mile high. I was an exceptional woman, I was a revolutionary, I was a writer, I was this or that, and yet it struck me with a great thud in my solar plexus from which I never quite recovered. And I think that the 60s were largely a period of beginning to recognize the depth and the earth-shaking potentialities of feminism. Just in my own life, never even mind the world. And I think the putting together of that anthology was one of the things that pushed me over the brink from being a women's liberationist, that is, from seeing women's oppression as one part of the male left, a valid part, but in its place, into becoming a feminist and seeing everything in some way as stemming from the primary contradiction, as it were, the subjugation of women, more than half the species. And so what began as an attempt to relate oppression of other peoples to myself, and see how I was oppressed and how that might make me a better fighter in the revolution of the 60s, became something that was suddenly very concrete, very personal, very real. It was in the bedroom, it was in the struggle with my husband, it was in the way in which I gave birth to my child, it was in the way dishes got washed and floors got scrubbed and words got used and poems became transformed, and it was multifarious and multiform and staggering.
Would you say the personal became political?
I would say that, Sandra. I tell you, that's yes, indeed. At not just one level, but every level that I could have possibly conceived, and a million others I never could have foreseen. And I'm not recovered. I mean, I don't think there ever comes a point at which one has achieved some mythical level of high consciousness, because no matter how angry you think you become, something always happens to pull the carpet out from under you, and the rhetoric disappears, the jargon is meaningless, the words which have come to be important if for no other reason than verbal shorthand, words like sexism, like male supremacy, begin to even fade away into some kind of meaninglessness, and what one is left with is still the reality of pain and of unfair. This is unfair. We are people, we live, we bleed, we breathe. This is not necessary.
That whole experience of coming from the left is so foreign, I think, to most women who consider themselves part of the women's movement. And it's such a special experience to have had, in a sense. And I wonder if there's a way to convey that experience, to describe it, or to at least describe the transition.
Well, mostly I think when I think of my years in the left and the transition, particularly when I think of it in terms of a comparison with women who came to feminism from other areas, the kitchen, the suburban ghetto, whatever other areas. Mostly I tend to be ashamed. Not because of the idealism that sent me and a great many other women of my immediate generation into the left, but because of the enormous arrogance that we carried along with that vision.
Would you say intolerance?
I would say intolerance, yeah. It's funny, it's a very basic contradiction, because the original vision was quite beautiful. I mean, it for me is summed up in the early civil rights days, when at one point, I think it was in Mississippi, one of the worst of the southern sheriffs was in the hospital with some kind of stomach trouble, colitis or something, and a group of little black children, all around ages 4 and 5 and 6, went spontaneously and stood in the rain outside his hospital and sang and prayed for him to get better. And it wasn't just a tactic. I think of moments like that when I think of the best of the left. He got better, of course, and came after them with fire hoses. But there was a spirit of idealism and real vision that I affirm and always will affirm. That it degenerated into largely, certainly in the new left, the white male-dominated left, rhetoric and one-upmanship and gratuitous John Wayne shootout at the OK Corral violence was a great tragedy, perhaps a uniquely American tragedy, I don't know, but I certainly do know that that those were male-defined tactics, and that what happened is that at some point not coincidental with the flowering of feminist consciousness, a whole lot of us in the left finally got it through our heads that this was not our style of making change. And we should stop apologizing for the fact that we were women. What was this? And began to talk to each other as women. And in fact began to learn a lot of things about ourselves as women that housewives and women in other areas of the women's movement that we had previously sneered at, as civil rights feminists and reform feminists, that those women had been doing for a long time. So that there was a, for me at least, a process of salutary humbling, for which I'm enormously grateful.
I think one of the things that I liked about the book was the fact that you were very upfront about that. You're very upfront about some of the mistakes that you made and some of the mistakes that you think that the movement made early on. And talk a little bit about the book, because probably by the time this show is on the air, the book will be just coming out and very few people will have read it.
Well, the book excites me and scares me tremendously, because I have been vulnerable in going too far, the way I have been nowhere else, at least not in prose. In my poems, there's always a seventh veil that is ripped away. But poetry is its own, I guess, for a lot of people, mystique. I don't think it should be, and I think the renaissance in feminist poetry is helping, in fact, a lot of people to relate to poetry in a very real and accessible way, and I think that's all to the good. There still is something about prose that people feel less afraid to grapple with, though, and I'm ripping apart that veil in prose in this book the way I've never done before, so that there are sections, for example, BC, Before Consciousness, that include a series of letters that I wrote to my husband, who was a poet, Kenneth Pitchford, and this was before feminism or any tools had made themselves available for struggle with the man one loves. They were not letters written from a distance. They were letters, in fact, written within the same apartment, except I couldn't say these things aloud. And I think that despite all my thoughts of being an exception at the time as a writer and a revolutionary, that they are the classic housewife's complaints. There are diary entries and journal entries.
You hadn't intended him to see the letters, had you?
I think I had dreamt that at some point I would be able to show them to him.
But certainly
you
didn't think of publishing them.
No, oh no. And I didn't even show them to him for about 2 years.
What did they say, Robin? What did those letters say?
I think they're mainly a cry for a common language. Because there was, even at that time, no question but that I loved him, and in fact that I knew he loved me. We're still together, in fact, 15 years later. But at that point, there was no way in which the different languages that we as a woman and a man were speaking about sexuality, about housework, about the ways in which we related to our writing and each other's writing. There was no way really in which those two languages could be translated, and the translator came about, if one is to personify it, with feminist politics. It gave a tool for saying, this is not just my whim, my craziness, my idiosyncrasy. In fact, this is not just me, this is political. This is, I am not alone. And to this day, when, for example, I get nervous and embarrassed about thinking about the private things that are put forth in that book, not only in the letters, but journal entries, diary entries, things about my son, Blake. I think, I'm going to really be very vulnerable. And what I must remind myself of is that every time I've taken a step that I have felt others might think was, quote, going too far, as if one never could, there has always been the feminist miracle, which is that somehow, somewhere, there have been women who have said, oh, you too? Isn't that funny? And the connections have been made again, and one discovers anew that one is not alone. And if someone says it aloud, there's a chorus. In fact,
and that's your intention for this book.
Yes, that is my intention. To hear I hope, from those other mothers and wives and women who have loved beauty and art and maybe been afraid to say so in a political context, and women who have wanted to love whomever, a woman, a man, a child, themselves. I think I was drawn to feminism because I think it has always been a politics profoundly about love.
Well, one of the things, though, about the movement that has often been voiced as a criticism, and I think in part valid, is that our definitions of what's permissible are very narrow. And you have now written a book, and you're speaking to mothers and wives, and it seems to me that this has not been a pervasive voice in the movement.
No, it hasn't. I mean, I've been in the movement, and I've been active, and I have sort of tried to not hide these things away, because I mean, when you're nursing a child, it's very hard. But I have downplayed those things, so I am coming out as, it's not just trying to reach those women out there. I mean, as I'm one of them, and I think we've all been afraid of being incorrect. That's a kind of leftover from male politics, as if there were one route to the kind of vast, complex, and profound changes we're really talking about.
Do you think, to sort of get away from that for a minute, do you think the women's movement has a radical voice at this point that is as strong and as healthy as it was at one point?
I think so, but I think it's where perhaps one would least expect it. And I don't know that it's important to even name it as a radical voice. If one goes back to the definition, etymologically, of radical, let's say, that is something that goes to the root, like radish, really the core meaning, the essence, then it leaves behind all sorts of jargon of radical running off at the mouth, and you begin to think, okay, well then the root, the heart of women's oppression, it does boil down very much to something that has occurred between the sexes. That means that there is a cathexis between women and men, and with all respect for and support of lesbian feminism, separatist feminism, etc., that still means that the problem is going to be engaged, struggled over, and perhaps solved or not on the basis of that cathexis. And that also involves love, because we do give birth some of the time to male children.
Right.
And
let's talk about that, Robin.
Let's do that.
Let's talk about the fact that you have a son and what problems that used to pose for you.
Well, I think the most painful problems that it posed were from other feminists. Blake is a very nice person, and somebody that I will always want to know. And it was hard enough imagining the difficulty that he would be getting from the outside world, the patriarchy saying, "Ah, you're a little boy, come along and get the privileges we can give you for putting down little girls, for putting down women, for becoming a misogynist," as his own little peers were already becoming. But that somehow we could fight, all of us, Kenneth, Blake, me, together. I think what is soul-destroying is when one finds that one's sisters, for the most justifiable reasons, feel that a child is already hopeless because he's born male. That seems somehow self-defeating unless one's solution is androcide. And Audre Lorde said a wonderful thing at one point about having a male child, about a number of other things on which she found she was told she was incorrect, but particularly about having a male child. She said, "Yes, I have a male child, and it keeps me honest." And I think it's well, a word to live by. I could have perhaps I fell into enough rhetoric as it was, and still have to watch myself, but I think I could have perhaps fallen into that set of rhetoric too, about male children being the enemy, if I didn't know Blake. And the reality of that flesh and that voice and that love and that struggle and those tears when you come home from the playground and you are called a sissy and you are trying to really believe that sissy is an honorable word, and you want to fight the bad men and you want to help women, and you like the stories about Emmeline Pankhurst and you want to support them. but it hurts when your best friend says, I can't know you anymore because you sit at the girls' table.
How old is he now?
He's 7.5 now. And I don't know, your sons are older. Does it get worse? Does it get better?
No, it gets better.
It gets better?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Robin, what do you see as your role now in the women's movement?
I don't honestly know. I haven't a clue. I know I want to write poems. I'll do that till I die. And I want to write
Are you less
plays.
activist than you used to be?
Well, it depends on how you define activist. I mean...
well, you haven't been out on the streets lately, have you?
No, I haven't been out on the streets in the way I used to be out on the streets. I've been at my typewriter a lot, which for me, I think maybe, it's certainly the most deeply threatening activism, because it's the most vulnerable, if I'm going to really do it well. And I found it reaches more women than 1,000 leaflets on my street corner will. Maybe that's where it will be. That's where I feel the pinch most and where I can be most honest. So I hope I can be of some use to other women there. But one of the things the women's movement has also taught me is that I have rights too, as an artist, as a mother, as a wife, as an individual. You
mean you don't have to write things and not sign your name?
That's part of it. That's right. I cannot believe, but there it is. I mean, we did it. It's talked about in the book that there was a period when, after women having been anonymous for thousands of years, having written, you know, men's works and never having had our name signed to it, that one of the first things that happened when we get politicized, at least in the left, was that you immediately had to drop your name off things because it was elitist to sign it. I think there's a real moral cowardice involved there, too.
Robin, I want to talk about the state of the movement at the moment, but before that, I want to talk to you about something that really bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
And that is that women who came out of the left being terribly intolerant of women who didn't.
Mm.
And, you know, laying the most incredible kind of guilt trips. And I just think that, you know, it has to stop.
I think that's very true.
Credentials are fine, but, you know, I think
credentials are really silly.
it's taken
ultimately
really too far.
Phooey on credentials. I don't know what they mean anyway. I really don't. One could say that, I mean, who knows more about being anyone? I don't know what it is like to be you, or vice versa, and we can only then ultimately go on trust. And what was magical about the early consciousness-raising groups was that we looked for the similarities. We knew there were differences. We weren't emphasizing the differences. We were looking for the shared things and the glue, and we were not interested in putting each other down for the differences. And at some point, I certainly, as much as anyone else, began to get off on the differences. Maybe the pervasiveness of patriarchy, ranking, I don't know. But
well, I think there are women who still do, and
I think that is true.
I
think it's absurd. I think
it should stop now.
Well, it's got to stop. It's self-indulgent, and it is a form of tyranny.
Right.
And it's just that simple.
We don't have a lot more time. Are things as bad as some people say they are with the women's movement at the moment? I mean, is it going to survive? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think it's going to survive. I think that the most exciting thing, at least to me, that has happened recently, I guess you could say, is twofold. One is that domestically, the women's movement is less narrow in definition. Things like the housewives boycott, the meat boycott a few years ago, to me is a feminist organic action because women are doing it and it's over women's rights in some way. It's connected. And the other thing is that the movement's becoming global. And that will change all our consciousnesses and all our issues and all our emphases. And I don't just mean in a formal way like International Women's Year. I mean that I'm regularly now and organically in contact with women in Thailand and New Zealand, and we send books and articles and clippings back and forth, and there really begins to be something like a women's world community. And the potential of that, I don't know, the brain boggles at it.
But you do agree that we have to work at it, that it's not going to just...
Oh, there's no question. The goddess is not going to drop it from heaven if we run around and make little rituals.
It is not going to sustain itself because it's in our hearts and minds.
No, there's a quote from Chapman that Kenneth and I have loved for a long time that says, "And where love's form is, love is form." And so if we want it to happen, the will has to be transformed into matter. I think we are uniquely capable of doing that, but then we've got to do it.
Robin, would you read one of your poems?
Yes,
I'm not sure exactly how much time we have left, but I think we have time enough.
Well, this is one that you
We have 1 minute
like.
left.
I think we can get it in. It's called The Beggar Woman. Fact scums a mirage upon my retina, an after-image, a negative apparition. Some nights I sit cross-legged in the driveway, burnous-wrapped, a live pyramid, as if this ice cube's transpiration behind glass were real, as if that beetle could be hesitating on the wall. Some nights the driver runs me over, or worse, leaves gravel in the cup instead of coins, as if I could still choose. Dawn after city dawn I tense, horizontal as spent rain. Some nights the child waits with me, ribs stretching its gourd hollow skin, a silent drum on my lap, as if this hunger could be fed, as if your love could fill me. Some nights the angel of death rides by, ignoring us, reading the book of life inside his limousine's black temple, as if my own hand were not fused to the hilt of this dagger, as if the blade were not serrated by my will. Some nights I think they leave, circle, and return only to be sure I think they do, as if I could still hesitate, as if that ice of me could melt to rain. Some night the wheels will slow, the door will open, if they can be convinced that I am harmless, as if I could not steal my life inward toward the act, the way stones poise before they avalanche on one veiled head.